Hirlock, and welcome Minister to the Chamber today. I formally move the motion.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you. I think in preparing for this motion, obviously you can see that there's a huge amount of detail in the motion, and I suppose there's a lot of asks in the motion. But for me, what I'm going to ask of people today is more to start to begin to challenge themselves about what they think about what poverty is, how it continues to prevail in people's lives and how invasive it is, and what are the structures that actually create poverty in the first place. When I was growing up, I come from a family, a very, very working class family. My father grew up in the tenements and my mother grew up in Finglas. They didn't have much, and my father used to tell me stories about, having to use beer mats in the soles of his shoes to kind of stop the rain getting in, or collecting jam jars to get into the cinema with because they wouldn't have the money to, but you could exchange jam jars. And my granddad Losty and Finglas tell stories, and my family tell me stories about my granddad, what he would bring home, I suppose, from the dumps and from collecting. If there was ever an era for the Greens, it was definitely then, in terms of how much use people made of what they had in very hard and strained circumstances. But my granddad would make cots for the kids out of drawers from the chest of drawers and everything like that, and they made the best use of what they had. But as I began to grow up, I began to observe a different type of poverty. And it wasn't a poverty where I had holes in my shoes. I had shoes on my feet, but very much had a hole in my heart and my potential and my opportunity and who I was going to be in life and who my community was going to be in life. And I remember realising for the first time how poor so many people are within communities like mine. And I actually wasn't one of them. My parents worked, low minimum wage, but we never went to school hungry. But I watched as my community did, and I watched the struggle and the sharing of clothes and, very secretly going down the road and giving a family on the road the clothes that don't fit you anymore and trying to keep people afloat like that. But as I began to get even older then and my brain started to really take in my environment, I began to really ask the questions about whether poverty is a personal thing, or is it a collective thing, or is it a societal thing? And it very much is about power, and it's about class. And one thing those who experience poverty don't have is power. They don't have the power to be able to create the resources to fix societal damage that has happened for decades upon decades upon decades. I read a quote that I'd like you to think about as I speak, which is from James Baldwin, and it's: anyone who has ever struggled with poverty knows how extremely expensive it is to be poor. Poverty costs, and it doesn't only cost in being able to live and survive, but it costs the potential of life. Each and every single person has one chance at life, and imagine if that one chance of life was impeded by struggle and by pain and having to persevere through life. I'd like to reflect on a minute from the comments from the Dáil Chamber this week, where we spoke about O'Connell Street and druggies. Now, how in 2022 do we have somebody who's the chair of an education committee talking about druggies and framing people in this way? We know that drug use and addiction prevails in the way that it does because of poverty. And if we are going to shame anybody, it never should be the individual. It should always be the conditions, the capitalist market, the conditions, the protection of profit over people that has led to poverty continuing in the way that it does. And when I think of that term, druggies, which is just dehumanising, actually, it's just to separate the person completely from who we are as a community, because they are me, we are them, they are Dublin, they are Ireland. They can't be separated from us. A person who uses drugs most often is trying to escape the reality of poverty. And if you chase that thread back from that type of drug use, you chase it very back into the halls of power, into Parliament. You chase it back through legislation after legislation for years and years that has not radically addressed poverty. In 2008, in the beginning of austerity, we closed down the Combat Poverty Agency, an independent agency that was responsible with being able to tackle policy, look at budgets, look at research, look at causes, look at solutions. And during one of the biggest austerities that any of our generations have ever experienced, they closed that down. We don't have an independent agency trying to address poverty. And we can't do cosmetic changes on poverty anymore. You know, a little bit of welfare here, a little bit of a charity over here. We need to radically address poverty. And to radically address poverty, we must radically address privilege, because they are relational. It's not about trickle-down economics. It's about looking at wealth, it's about looking at power, and it's about how do we dismantle that so there's an equal distribution. Not how do we put a load of poor people in a room and ask them how they solve their own poverty without the resources to do so. Because that's what we do when we continue to look to services and charities and put this middle class idea on working class people about how they're actually going to pull themselves up out of poverty. And this idea that, you know, there's a opportunity in society. There is no opportunity in society if the conditions in which we live are so unequal that the opportunity is literally impossible to see, impossible to take. And it's never about one person succeeding. We've only began to address poverty if everybody succeeds, if you will lift all communities out of poverty. And there's no point always pointing to, you know, the anomalies of the successful people within communities, because that's not enough. We need to congratulate people that manage social mobility, but we definitely don't need to point to them as some sort of job done, or, you know, because we need to actually really look at ourselves and what type of society it is that we want, you know. And wealth and power for the few and misery for the many is definitely not a society that I think any of us want to stand over. You know, and going back to again around the comments around drug use, around crime, around all these things, I don't think anybody that's ever experienced the things that I've had to experience in my life can actually think that people choose that way of life. I have people that feel like they're just waiting to die. Some of my friends are just waiting, just like welcoming death. Like, that's what poverty does. It seeps into everything that you are, everything that you hope for, your whole view on life. And people are literally getting to the end of their lives and it feels welcome. People wear poverty. They look unwell, they feel sad, and they're carrying way too much strain. And I read a book called Poverty Safari by Darren McGarvey, and I recommend that anybody who's interested in actually understanding entrenched poverty actually read it. And he's lots of great quotes in there, but one of them is, how do we solve poverty if all your jobs depend on it? And that's what we need to have a discussion about. Whose jobs depend on poverty existing? Because we have a poverty industry. We have an industry where poverty is literally profitable for other people. And we have to begin to address that. And we can't keep looking at individuals as to why they're not coming out of poverty without looking at the systems and the conditions which have created them in the first place. And then, you know, I suppose it's not easy to live in a society where people, structures and policies, you know, are implicated in creating the conditions for poverty to exist. But it's definitely not easy to be able to challenge those if you literally, your every day is based on your next decision without that day, with what happens that day. Like, we think about how to pay a bill or think about all these things, but poverty is so much bigger than that. It's so much more entrenched than that. And we can actually change that. I'm in this chamber 6 years and people will agree with me. People will nod their heads and they will agree. But nobody seems to take any responsibility for the fact that we are responsible for poverty. We make those decisions. And people sit around tables and make decisions about how not to address poverty. And that's why we need the Combat Poverty Agency. For me, poverty is literally a direct opposition to human dignity. And if we as a government can't afford people human dignity by ensuring that their lives are ones that are worth living, that they can build futures worth having, and if we can accept living in a society where some people don't have that and we do, we really need to reflect on that. We need to reflect on that and we need to act radically. We need to stop with cosmetic changes. We need to stop with small little welfare budgets here and there because it's cross-departmental. And to do that, we actually have to address what's inside ourselves. We're protecting the poverty industry. We're protecting policies that actually force people to die. Throughout pandemics, throughout hurricanes, throughout things that happen around the world, we always talk about the death count and the body count under these certain things, under pandemics and stuff, and weather warnings and all of these. If we actually truly cared and understood about the loss of life under poverty, and poverty falls then under the umbrella of policy, government policy, and a lack of will and ambition to radically address poverty in this country, I would go back to ask ourselves, does poverty benefit us, and are we willing to challenge that in ourselves? And has our careers and the careers of many others now become to rely on poverty? And I think that we really need to be able to stand up to that and radically address poverty in this country, because we are responsible.
Thank you.